Life. So let's get started. Today, we are going to be talking about restructure and redundancy. And it's really about understanding how to get it right. I will say that we are going to be really coming at it from more of a small business perspective today, because the majority of our clients do fall in the small business space. And I do know from looking at our registrations that the majority of our attendees here are from the small business space. Though I will mention a couple of things that are applicable for larger businesses as well. And as always, we're happy to have a discussion about anything specific afterwards. So my name is Carly Saw. I am the director here at Strawberry Seed Consulting, and let's get started. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we're all attending today, and pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples that are attending this evening. So just firstly, quickly, who are we? Well, we're Strawberry Seed Consulting. We do a boutique HR consulting firm, and we work with small businesses right around the country in all different types of industries. This is my gorgeous team. I was saying to my assistant Molly the other day when we were putting together a presentation that not only are they an amazing group of women, but they're pretty good looking too. So many of you may have dealt with some of our team over the years, and these are the gorgeous faces that do help out when you do reach out to Strawberry Seed. So what are we going to cover today? I'm going to go through a few different things. I'm going to talk about restructuring, what that actually means, and what are the really concentrating on the employment implications. Planning, what are the sort of things you need to consider? What consultation needs to look like? When it's time to make a decision, what are the things you should be thinking about? Communication, like how will you communicate the outcomes? And also moving forward, what's next? Now, anyone that has attended one of our webinars before will probably be very familiar with this slide. And it talks about the laws that govern employment. And I like to start with this because regardless of what you're doing when it comes to management of your people, these are the areas you need to be checking before you do anything in regards to employment. And, you know, I guess I can't go into detail today on what is in every single award or enterprise agreement or every single contract. So the national employment standards are the same for everyone, but the requirements will start to change depending on the industrial instrument that covers either your profession or your industry, and also depending on what you've got written in your employment agreements. So I just want to preface that before we went into detail. And I always encourage you, before you do anything, to double check what it says. And today we're talking about redundancy. So about redundancy, about consultation in your industrial instruments, or particularly in your contract arrangements as well. So what actually is restructuring? So a business restructure is a process of making some sort of significant change to your organisational structure, processes or operations. And that may be to improve performance, to increase efficiency, reduce costs, or to adapt to a particular change in the market. So if you are considering a business restructure, that could mean a whole heap of different things. So it could be that you're looking at changing the management structure, leadership roles, reporting lines, or decision making. I was involved in a large restructure when I was a graduate many years ago at RACV, where we went from having 8 different business units to 5. And so there was a significant change in the structure and who reported to who. Now, the one we'll really be concentrating on today is reducing or expanding your workforce, and that's including redundancies or hiring employees. So certainly redundancies in employment is where we're going to concentrate today. It could be reorganising departments, functions or business units, changing product or service offerings, merging or acquiring other businesses or companies, and also it could be altering a financial structure as well. So any of these things would be considered restructure, but the one that we're really going to be focusing on today is a restructure that does have an outcome that is redundancies. So what actually is a redundancy? Well, in Australia, it's a situation where an employer is terminating an employee's position or job because that position is no longer required to be done, or you no longer need as many people to do it, because the business is being restructured. So this can happen for a variety of reasons, and it could be a decline in business activity. There could be a new technology that's coming in that's replacing particular jobs, or you might be outsourcing, and there might be changes in the organisational structure itself. So the thing about a redundancy is it's a form of termination, and so it must be a genuine redundancy. A very, very common question we get is, I've got an underperforming employee, can I make them redundant? And that is not what a redundancy is there for. Now, you might find that you're in a situation where you have an underperforming employee, and at the same time you are doing a reorganisation in your business. So there may be an opportunity for that employee to be made redundant, but it should not be the purpose of a redundancy. A redundancy is not the option to get rid of an underperforming employee. And we'll touch on that a little bit more. But it is important that as an employer, you follow the right legal processes to ensure that the employee is treated fairly and they receive all the right entitlements to ensure that it actually ends up being treated as a genuine redundancy. So what actually is a genuine redundancy? So it's when the person's job doesn't need to be done by anybody else. Now, it's important to clarify that, because it's about a person is not made redundant, a position is being made redundant. And so therefore you no longer need a person to fulfill that role. Now, that could mean that the role is no longer required to be done by anybody within that business. It's being outsourced, or it's no longer needed. It could be that the responsibilities and activities that person takes when they're at work are actually redistributed amongst other positions within the business, and therefore it's no longer required to be done by anyone as a position itself. But it doesn't mean someone else doesn't have to do their role. Or it also could be reducing the number of people that do a particular position in the business. So you might have previously needed 10 people to fulfill a role, but due to a business downturn, you only need 5 now to fulfill that role. So any of those scenarios are a genuine redundancy. And the other thing that makes it a genuine redundancy is that the employer has followed any consultation requirements in the award or enterprise agreement, the industrial instrument, or other registered agreements. So you do need to ensure that you are following the consultation process that is dictated by the industrial instrument you're covered by. But it's also good practice, particularly if you are going to, it doesn't matter whether you're covered by an industrial instrument or not, if you ever need to defend that redundancy, the fact that you have gone through a consultation process is very much in your favour. If you have to defend it and provide evidence. And it's always on the employer to provide evidence that they did follow the process, not the employee to prove that they didn't. And when an employee's dismissal can be proven to be a genuine redundancy, they can't make an unfair dismissal claim. And by that, I mean they can make a claim to Fair Work, but it would be easy to defend because you could show that it was a genuine redundancy. So I guess the opposite of that is what isn't a genuine redundancy. So when you still need someone to do the job, and so therefore you're going to hire someone else to do the job, it's not going to be seen as a genuine redundancy. And often this is when the question comes up because someone says, I want to get rid of this employee, they're underperforming, can I just make their position redundant? And the next question is, how long can I go until I rehire somebody else? The answer to that is generally 6 months is considered to probably be a good rule of thumb, but that's not a genuine redundancy, and that shouldn't be the form of termination that you're actually pursuing. Now, that's not to say that if circumstances change, you cannot actually rehire, you cannot fill that position. So if it's a genuine redundancy at the time the decision is made, you have a strong business case. For example, you've lost a large client, or you've lost a large, you've got a project that's finished and you genuinely have no more work for that person at the moment, and you lay off a couple of employees. If in 2 months' time, suddenly you get a new job, you get a new project, you get a big new client, and you need to start rehiring, you're going to be under no obligation to rehire those previous employees that you made redundant. Because there was a genuine business case at the time that there was no work, but now there is. The difference here is when you just dismiss somebody, say it's a redundancy, but then turn around and just hire somebody else. Now, it's not a genuine redundancy if you haven't followed the requirements to consult under the industrial instrument. And also whether you could have reasonably, in the circumstances, given the employee another job within the employee's business or an associated entity. And we'll talk about redeployment options because you do need to explore those options. So the consequences of getting it wrong, I've already mentioned unfair dismissal. So the employee could make a claim for unfair dismissal that it was not a genuine redundancy. Therefore, it's not a fair dismissal. The other potential issue of getting it wrong would be a general protections claim, where they could claim that you as an employer took an adverse action against them because of a protected right. Genuinely, redundancies do come under unfair dismissal, but someone could claim, well, the real reason that you made them redundant or chose them for redundancy was because of a protected right. So, they could say it's still a legitimate redundancy, but the reason they were selected for redundancy was because they took a lot of sick leave, or because they had questioned their pay, or because they had were discriminated against in some way. So you do need to ensure that you have a transparent process so that you can always defend any of these claims if they did come up. So the first step is really planning. The best way to approach a redundancy when you believe there's going to be a redundancy process and you're restructuring your business is to have a plan. Now, the first phase is the planning phase. It's actually sitting down and going, okay, what are the things that we need to do? What's the process we need to follow? Who do we need to consult with? Who will we need to get involved in this process? What sort of timeline are we going to set up? Are we going to, what steps do we need to take? So you need to think about that in advance. That shouldn't be something you do on the fly. And that plan can actually also be used as evidence that it is a genuine redundancy, because you can show that if you had a plan in place and you followed that plan, that's very much in your favour. The second phase is consultation, and we'll get into that in a moment. And then finally, the outcome phase after the consultation. And each stage of the process should have clear actions and timelines that you will step through. Again, you can have some flexibility in those timelines, but it also shouldn't be a process that you're rushing. So often I see people try and implement the plan after they think they've already done most of these steps, and that's not great. So, if you think that there could be you're looking at restructuring, you're looking at making some changes in your business, and you believe one of the outcomes could be redundancy, sit down and plan out how you're going to approach it. So that planning phase should include preparing a business case. So that's why. Why are you going about this? Is it because we have had to close one of our locations and now we no longer need as many staff? Is it that we have implemented new technology, we've had a downturn in business and we need to reduce our numbers? And being able to justify that with a business case is very important, because then you can defend it if it's ever questioned. You want to prepare a communication strategy. So who are you going to communicate with, and who needs to know about this process, and when are you going to be communicating with them? And you want to inform employees of the process that you're going to undertake. Now, there is no reason for you to make reference to redundancies at that point when you're just starting this process and letting employees know that you're about to go through a process of doing a business review, that you are going to be looking at what the business requirements are, and that you will start to communicate with them individually as that evolves. You should be providing an overview of the impending changes that are going to be looked at, and how they might affect the business, and how you're looking at mitigating them affecting the business. But you don't at this point have to say positions will be made redundant, because you haven't had the consultation process yet. You haven't, this should be done early, not once you've already made the decision. So this is a little example of an email that I've sort of changed a little bit, that we did several years ago for a client who was at that planning phase. And so the start of their communication strategy was to, they'd come back from overseas, a husband and wife team that owned the business, and they had decided that, look, one of the things that they had been doing while they were away is really considering where the business was heading and what the implications might be. So this is an example of an email that they used when they got back from their trip, to let the all staff within the business know that they had it had given them the opportunity to think about what was happening and where they want to improve and what they want to do, so that now that they were back, they were going to be undertaking a review of the business and what that would look like, and that they will be chatting to each individual over the next few weeks to see, to let them know how those changes might affect them, so that they were in the loop. So they let the business know that they were about to go through this process, and then that was the first step of their communication plan and their first part of their plan in terms of how they manage this process. So employees were not blindsided. Gone are the days where an employee is allowed to be blindsided by a redundancy. So some additional things to think about while you're still in the planning phase, and these may evolve as you go. Do you need to conduct a skills analysis? So if there is going to be a reduction of the number of people doing a particular job, that is probably a really critical step to take. So if you're going to go from 8 people down to 4 people, what are you going to base that decision on? Which leads to the next question, which is, will you consider voluntary redundancies? Sometimes when you're reducing numbers and there's a large number of people, putting out an idea for voluntary redundancies can be a way of getting at least a few people to make that decision for you. The risk of that is always that the people who take the voluntary redundancies are not the people that you would prefer would take the voluntary redundancies, or they were the ones with the skills that you need to keep. So whether or not you go down that path should be considered carefully. Because once you put it out there, you can't just put it out to one person and say, oh, we'd like you, do you want a voluntary redundancy, but we don't want to offer that to anyone else. So if, you would prefer to have more of a say in who stays and who doesn't based on skill mix, then a skills analysis is a really good idea at that point. And that's something you'll need to plan for because it will take time. Will there be opportunities for redeployment? Now, redeployment does mean not just looking at, if you have multiple entities that are related or businesses related under one entity, you do need to not just look at, oh, well, our little business here of 6 people doesn't have any opportunities if you've got another entity that potentially does have opportunities for redeployment. And we'll get, as I said, we'll get into that. And the other thing is, part of your planning phase should be thinking about, are you going to offer outplacement services or EAP support to any employees that are affected? That may be something you need to organise in advance. Quite often we do outplacement services at Strawberry Seed, and there are times when organisations will speak to us in advance and let us know, look, we're going through this process. There's likely to be a few people made redundant. Can we line up your services ready to go before that happens? Which brings us to consultation. So consultation is asking for and considering an employee's view when making your decisions. And consultation is actually required not just through redundancy, but through any major change within a workplace that will affect employees in a significant way. A lot of industrial instruments, particularly awards, will, and most other agreements will have a section in there about consultation for change. And that could be something as simple as changing working hours, duties, work locations, but it also includes redundancies. So there is a legal requirement, if you have that in an industrial instrument, to actually go through that process. And look, that could, I've gone through a consultation process at one of my companies I worked for when we changed to a 40-hour, we changed to a 40-hour work week with one of them, where we, and there was a lot of consultation back and forth with employees. Now the majority did 2 hours a week overtime already, so they were happy to sort of change it, but we consulted. I've also been through that when we've changed, when we pay people, so say from weekly to fortnightly or vice versa, that can involve a consultation process, but definitely redundancies needs one as well. So you do have obligations under the Fair Work Act to consult with a union. If you decide to dismiss 15 or more employees, or if you know that at least one person who you will be being made redundant is a union member. Now, the employees don't actually need to be covered by an award or enterprise agreement for that to happen. And there's also a requirement, if you're going to be dismissing 15 or more employees through redundancy, to let Centrelink know. So there are a few obligations there that if you are putting off large numbers of people, that you do need to be aware of. And that's usually more likely to be an implication for a larger employer, but I think that's important to note. So what does consultation actually look like? So a consultation clause in an industrial instrument generally will require consultation where an employer has decided to introduce major changes in production, programming, organisation structure or technology that is likely to significantly affect their employees. So they're required to notify employees who may be affected by the change, to discuss the proposed changes with those employees as soon as possible after any decisions are made, to provide them with written information about the changes, how they might affect them, and any measures that you are taking to mitigate or reduce adverse effects. And that's particularly when you're talking about things like bringing in a technological change. And to give prompt consideration to any matters that are raised by employees. But what does it look like in practice? Because we're talking about small businesses now, mostly. So in practice, consultation is giving employees the opportunity to be heard and express their views so that they may be considered in any major decisions that are being made that affect their employment. It should be real. It's not a merely just a perfunctory or an afterthought. And, you know, often we get phone calls from employers that say, oh, we're making someone redundant. What do we need to do? And we're like, have you consulted with them? And the answer is no. And so now they've got to backtrack. You know, it needs to be part of your planning. Genuine consultation means listening to what the employee has to say. And what that actually means is telling them about how their role is going to be affected, giving them a chance to share with you any thoughts that they might have on it. Here is what is going to be happening in the business. Here's the changes that are going to be happening. You know, we've had a downturn. We cannot sustain all the positions we have. We've looked at doing a restructure. Here's what that looks like. And at this stage, it looks like your position may be affected. So how does that affect you? Talking to them about redeployment options, talking to them about, you know, why their position's no longer needed, but giving them their opportunity to have their say. They might raise a really strong case on something you haven't thought about in regards to the structure. There may be something that they raise that they do that you weren't aware of, or a skill that they have that you didn't know about. The other thing they might do is they might say to you, look, if there are going to be redundancies, then I'm actually really happy to take a voluntary redundancy. If someone, you know, or I'd be happy to sort of step out because I'm at a time in my life where this is what would suit me. So again, that might actually make your decision a little easier, because if, you know, there might be an employee, for example, that's close to retirement that says, you know what, I'd be happy to take a package and step out. And so through the consultation process, the consultation is not telling someone they've been made redundant. It's telling them that this may affect them and giving them the opportunity to have their say. And I have seen scenarios where what they have put forward has changed decisions. It may not, but it can. It is also important to note that it's not the right to be consulted doesn't mean the right of veto. So just because you've gone to someone and gotten their feedback doesn't mean that you have to do what they've suggested. And they might have a really strong case on why their position should stay in the organisation. But unfortunately, due to budget and due to the fact that you financially can't sustain their position anymore, you still might have to make that position redundant. So the right to be consulted is not the right to veto. So you as management do have the right to make that final decision. But you genuinely need to give the consultation a chance and have a real discussion. So once you've gone through consultation, we are now at the time of making a decision. So what should you be considering? You need to consider all the information that employees have provided to you during the consultation phase, and generally to consider that. This shouldn't be a rush process. It's not a race. You know, it's not a race to try and make a decision. So in fact, the more time you take and the more careful and considered you are through this process, the more likely it will be that you would, if it was ever questioned, it would be seen as a genuine redundancy. Think about things like, will you need to interview employees? So if you have, again, I'll give the example of 8 employees going into 4 roles. You currently have 8 operators, you only need 4 operators moving forward. Are you going to give everyone the opportunity to apply for their job and go through that process and make that part of the process? If that's the case, you need to leave the time in there to do it. And that should be decided in your planning process, actually. But, you know, if you need to interview employees, how will you do that? How will you manage that process? And you need to be finished that process before you're actually going and finalising any decisions. Have you explored all redeployment options? Have you looked at if you've got any vacancies in your business or a related entity, you need to be telling the employees what they are. It's not up to you to decide that they're not qualified or they wouldn't want to do that position. You're not insulting their intelligence by saying, here's a list of the current vacancies we have. Or in some instances, that might be, we currently do not have any vacancies. We're not recruiting at all. There are no other positions for you to be redeployed to, but you genuinely need to demonstrate that you've actually explored that option. And again, will you accept voluntary redundancies? That can help influence your decision. If you've had it through the consultation process, a couple of people put their hand up, suddenly you might only be making a decision about 1 or 2 roles. You might not be making a decision on getting rid of 4 people, but only 2 people because 2 people have put their hand up. The thing with voluntary redundancies, though, is you could have 8 people out of 8 put their hand up for voluntary redundancy. And as I mentioned, you can have an employee put their hand up for voluntary redundancy who's someone you prefer to keep in your organisation. So you do need to be mindful of that before you go down that process. But again, I can't stress enough to not rush the process. Don't try and push it through really quickly. Take your time, consider what people had to say, consider your options. It shouldn't be a quick process. Which brings us to communication. Now, communication should be happening throughout this whole process. I gave you an example earlier of that initial communication, and certainly the initial communication may be in a written form like that to employees. It also might be something that is communicated at a team meeting or a toolbox meeting or something like that. So part of your plan should have been who are you going to communicate with? And there's really 3 kind of areas you need to consider. So 1, the employees that may be impacted by the change or restructure. The second is the rest of the business, because it might only be one part of your business that's being that will be restructured and be affected. But you do need to consider how you're going to communicate with the rest of the business, because if it is only one area of the business that will be impacted, those employees in other areas are going to be worried about how it might impact theirs. So as much as you need to talk to people about, how it will impact them, you need to not forget about those that aren't impacted and be communicating. And also external stakeholders, who are the stakeholders that might need to be involved. And that can be, once you've made your decision, letting clients know, the thing about communication is I don't think you can do it too much. If you have a communication plan in place, you should have thought about who you might need to know things and at what part of the process. And just know, as soon as you start talking to people, regardless of how you say to people to keep things confidential, things leak, people talk. So you probably don't want, potential customers hearing that you're putting people off in an area of the business that works for them. That could cause them some great concerns. That can have impacts on the business as well. So communication should be, holistic. It should be thinking about everybody and letting people know when you'll come back to them. So it may be we're telling you this is where we're at now, and then the next part of this will go for 2 weeks, and then we'll communicate with you again. Now that 2 weeks could blow out, but you could go back at the end of that 2 weeks and say, actually, we're still going because a few new things have come to light, so it will be another week, but you're constantly letting them know what is happening. When there is dead air, people will fill it, and you don't want that to happen. The format of the message should be appropriate to what's actually the stage you're at and what's actually happening. It's okay to maybe send out that initial email to let everyone know that you're starting a process and that you'll talk to people individually. But once you do get to that individual part, that should be done in person. They're conversations. They're not, and certainly you do not inform somebody that they are being made redundant via email. I know I have seen examples, particularly, say, in America, where there's some slightly different employment laws or lack thereof. I've worked for an American company before where they will send out a group email and say, you are being made redundant. That is not something that will ever stand up in Australia. So when will you communicate with each group? Make sure that's in your plan. Again, if you've thought about this beforehand, it makes it so much easier. And what will the messaging be? What are you actually telling people? You want to be consistent. You want to make sure that everybody is getting the same message. You do not want different groups getting told different things. You don't want one group of employees being told everything's going to be fine, you're all good, and then someone else being given the fear, and then they talk to each other, and that just doesn't match up. So, you want to have very clear messaging, you want to have consistent messaging, and you want to have frequent messaging. So one of the groups in particular that is obviously going to be the most important when it comes to communicating are those employees that are being made redundant, those that are impacted. So once the decision-making process has been finalised, those employees need to be informed first about what the decision is, and that the decision has been made to make their position redundant. You want to let them know that you've considered what they've had to say, but that the reason why is, so say, for example, they've given you a great case on why you keep their position, but unfortunately you just financially can't. Say, look, you made some great points. We really, considered what you had to say, and we would love to keep your position. Unfortunately, the financial situation we're currently in means it's just not viable for us to do so. You need to provide them with redeployment options if you haven't already. Even if you've discussed redeployment previously, leaving them with a list of positions that are available, and letting them know, this shouldn't be a case of, here, you're redundant, everything's done. If there are redeployment options available, then you might say, basically, we have, your position is made redundant. That has happened. Again, position, not person. Your position is made redundant. So we have, this is what this means for you. Here's the redundancy package you'll be entitled to. Here is the amount of notice that you'll be given, etc. But you might also say, here are a list of redeployment options for you. We're happy to discuss any of these with you. We're happy for you to go away and think about it and come back and discuss. And again, this is a conversation. So someone might say, no, look, I'm happy to take the redundancy, or they might say, no, I want to go away and think about it. In terms of things like notice period, you've got to start with whatever is in their contract industrial instrument, but that could be longer too. So you need to think about what works best for you. Now, one of the clients we're currently working with doing some redundancies, they have just told a number of their employees they're making them redundant, but they're not finishing until the end of June. So they've given them heaps of notice, and during that notice period, they're going to be giving them outplacement support, time off, which they can do during working hours. They're going to be giving them time off to look for other work, and if they find something in the meantime, they'll negotiate that with them and they'll shorten that period. But you need to be clear on that. Or do you work in an industry where if somebody is going, they've got to walk out the door because there is particular intellectual property or confidentiality issues that might apply? Not ideal in a redundancy situation, but they do happen. So there may be times where you finish someone up immediately. You need to have thought about that. So when you have this discussion with the employee, you're telling them all the information. What are their entitlements? Now, if you are a business that is considered a small business, so less than 15 employees, there may not be redundancy entitlements available. If someone's got less than 12 months service, they won't have redundancy entitlements available. And that's any size of business, but there is no entitlement to redundancy payouts, or a redundancy payment on top of other entitlements for a small business. However, you need to check your industrial instrument, because if you have an enterprise agreement that talks about it, there are some awards, and I'll give you an example, is the Building and Construction Award. So under the Building and Construction Award, even small businesses must pay redundancy. So that's also something to check. And what have you written in your contracts of employment? That's another thing to check. So those things all need to be checked as well to make sure you're in line with them, and other entitlements. Now, I've had situations with small business owners that want to, even though they're not required by law to pay a redundancy payment, they choose to do so as an ex gratia payment, that as a sign of good faith for that, what that employee has done. So again, these are decisions that need to be made before you talk to the employee, so you're giving them all the information. And by how will you support them? That is, I'm talking about things like outplacement services. Do you have an EAP program that you can direct them to if they're finding it difficult to cope? Are there other services such as financial advice available through your EAP that might be helpful to them? And you want to provide that information in writing to them, because I've sat in meetings, I've been part of delivering the information to people that they're being made redundant. And even when people are expecting it, it's a hit. They're not necessarily taking in all the information that you're giving them. So you want to be able to give them information in writing to take away and think about and digest at their own leisure, that they can then come back and ask questions if they need to. So what are the next steps as you move forward? As a business, once you have looked after those employees that are impacted, the next thing to think about is actually, that's not the end. It's, you need to communicate the new structure to all employees, everyone else within the organisation. If that's going to impact other roles, you need to make sure that those employees ensure that their new roles and responsibilities are understood. How is that? And I mean, even just the stress and if you're in a busy environment and people know other people are leaving, that can cause a lot of stress. It can monitor your culture. And I can guarantee you that employees are watching how you handle a restructure with, even though they're not personally impacted, they may know the people who were impacted, and they will see how you handle it. And that is going to have a really big impact on what happens with your culture after this. Because you might find that you get it done and you walk away, and suddenly the employees that are there are going, well, I didn't like the way that the company handled this. I didn't like the way that they treated people. And that makes them question whether they want to stay. So it can have an impact, but I've also seen it have a positive impact when it's done with empathy. It's done with care and kindness. There's lots of communication to all parties involved. And also helping them understand if it is going to impact their job in terms of additional responsibilities, what that means and what the new structure is and who they report to and how it will work moving forward. So I've seen many organisations do a lot of work on how to deal with the people who are directly affected, but they forget those who are indirectly impacted. So you want to make sure that you think about that and you certainly work on that moving forward. So I wanted to leave plenty of time to ask questions because I have been quite general in what I've covered today. So what are the key takeaways? Redundancy is not a solution for an underperforming employee. I can't emphasize that enough. People see it as an easy solution. Now, are there times when you are in a situation where you've got an underperforming employee and you also, or an employee that's got some behavioural issues, and you are also going through a restructuring process of some kind, and the gods align and suddenly you have an opportunity to make that person redundant? Yes, but you want to be able to prove it's a genuine redundancy, because the thing is, one of the reasons they could claim unfair dismissal is go, well, the real reason is they didn't want to manage me. And redundancy is not an alternative to going through a process of managing an underperforming employee. We did a whole webinar last year on, and it's on our website if someone wants to watch it, on termination and preparing for that and what to consider. So, really don't look at it as a solution. We had a client who in February or late January 2020 rang us and said, can I make this person redundant? And the answer was no. Like, they didn't have a legitimate case for making that person redundant at all. And so we started a performance management process, and then COVID hit. And they had a lot of business ties to China, and it really impacted them. So then they were in a situation where they could make that person redundant. They didn't need that person's role anymore, but they were able to do it in a way that was legitimate without too much risk. Please take your time. Don't rush through the process. It's not a race. It's something that should be done thoughtfully and carefully. And, when I have seen situations where someone's like, we tell you we're going to, on Monday, that we're looking at this restructure, we consult with you on Tuesday, and then on Wednesday, we give you a letter and tell you that you're going. And that makes it really difficult to demonstrate that you've had a thoughtful and considered process. Plan ahead. Plan it out as much as you possibly can. Plan for all the different scenarios that might eventuate. Even if you don't follow it to the letter, at least it shows that you've tried to have a thoughtful process. Consult in a genuine way. have those open and honest discussions with people and be genuine in those discussions and listen to what they have to say. And the final thing I want you to think about, and I want to leave you with, is positions are made redundant, but redundancy affects people. You know, it's easy when you're, well, it's not, I'll be honest, it's not easy. I've been through many restructures in large organisations and helped a lot of smaller organisations with them. And it's often difficult. It's a difficult decision to make. You don't want to not have those people work for you anymore. And, you know, even when it's a really positive change for the organisation, it can have a negative effect on some people's jobs that are no longer required. So whilst we're talking about positions, when we're making the decision on the restructure, once then you have to deliver that message, it's actually affecting someone's livelihood. And so if you can think about it as having an impact on someone's livelihood all the way through, you can do it with care and compassion and empathy, and you'll have a much better outcome for everybody. Before I open up for questions, I'm more than happy for people to start putting some questions in the Q&A or the chat. We do have some public training courses coming up. For anyone in Brisbane, we have a leadership training workshop, a public workshop coming up on the 4th of May. We also have a lot of mental health first aid coming up. Unfortunately, our May blended online workplace mental health first aid has sold out. So May has no places available, but we do have many places available in June and August, though they are filling up quickly. We also have a 2-day in-person mental health first aid course coming up in Torquay in June. As I said, all the details on booking and everything are on our website. If you are a Strawberry Seed client, you can access discount codes to attend any of our trainings. So please reach out to your HR advisor or myself. Our next webinar in May, just to let you know, and I will send a link to this when I send out a recording, is finding new employees and sharing some of the tricks of a trade. So Kelly, our recruitment and HR advisor, is going to talk a bit about some of the challenges that people have been going through with recruitment in a lot of industries recently, and sharing some ideas and tips on, you know, how you can improve your process of actually finding the right people, but also then when you are going through the process of interviewing and selecting the right people for your business, some good information on that as well. Please follow us on all our social media. We share a lot of information. We share about what we're doing, but also information on cases and things that are happening in the world of HR. So we'd love to see all of you on there. But now I'm really happy to spend the last 15 minutes, if anyone's got any specific questions they want to ask, to open it up for questions. You can pop them in the chat or in the Q&A section, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that anybody has. This is the awkward bit where I sit here quietly to see whether anyone has any particular questions that they would like answered. While we're waiting to see if anybody wants to ask any questions, I will say again, there is a reason why it was general, because there's a lot of nuances and idiosyncrasies that are involved in anything to do with termination. So a lot of the information we provided was fairly general, because it's very difficult to get too specific until you know all the circumstances. So if you do need help, you know, we are seeing, as we've started 2023, and the reason that we chose this topic was because we are starting to get a lot of questions around restructure and redundancy. And so we want to make sure that we are, you know, getting some information out there. Okay, if we have a team member comes forth offering a voluntary redundancy, do you then need to accept it? I'm going to assume that you mean that, like, if you're going through this process and an employee says to you, hey, I'm happy to volunteer to be the person made redundant. So if that's the case, if during the consultations process, someone puts their hands up and says, hey, you know, I would be happy to take a voluntary redundancy, you don't have to accept it. If you haven't put it out that voluntary redundancy is on the table, and that, you know, put that out to everybody, then no, you don't necessarily have to accept that. You can say, well, look, I understand that, you know, thank you for letting me know that. But, you know, if you're not going down that path and we're going through a skills analysis at the moment, but I will take that into consideration with my decision making. Maybe it works for you, maybe it doesn't. If there isn't enough work for a full-time admin and looking to make their role redundant, do I have to offer them part-time? No, you don't have to offer them part-time. It's a tricky one. So their position is, if you've got someone who's full-time and you have decided that that role is no longer required to be done full-time, and that you now only require a part-time role, actually, well, you've got to tell them and give them that is an option of redeployment. So in terms of, you don't, if you're making that full-time role redundant and you're not replacing it, then there is no alternative redeployment option. However, if you're saying this role is no longer full-time and we're now we only need a part-time role. So the full-time role is redundant. So that's definitely redundant, but we have a part-time, we're going to reduce it to a part-time role. You do have to look at that as a redeployment option for them. And again, this is when someone often puts that up as a, an example of when they want to make someone redundant. Well, what happens if I just make their position part-time? Can I just get rid of them and give that role to someone else? If the reason you want to do that is because they're underperforming, then manage them as an underperforming employee, don't manage them as a redundancy. But it would be a legitimate redundancy because the role is no longer required to be done by someone full-time. So therefore, that's a significant change. However, you would at least have to have a discussion with the person currently in the role on whether that works for them. And for part-time doesn't work for everybody. But again, it's also getting into what are the specific circumstances in each workplace, the size of the workplace, the number of employees, all of those things need to be taken into consideration. But good question, because we do get that quite a bit. Is there any other questions that anybody might want to ask while they've got me? Oh, we do. We have an employee who has been on parental leave and is due back in June. Her department has undergone some changes and her previous role has evolved into a different role. Some aspects remain the same, but some duties are different. We aren't sure if she's qualified to do the new role. What do you do if the role has changed? Do we need to offer it to her? She's indicated she doesn't want to return to her previous role and only wants 10 hours a week. We need someone to do 3 days a week in that role. Well, it's kind of two different questions there, I think. If you are going through a restructure process and you have someone on parental leave, you should actually still include that. They're still an employee. You need to include them in the consultation process. So you should be consulting with them while they're, invite them into that process while they're on parental leave. Recognise that they're on parental leave, but this is going to affect their role. Therefore, they should be treated no differently than any other employee that is affected by a restructure. It's because then, you're having a discussion with her about that role. And that's different to, because I guess if that process wasn't happening and she's indicated she doesn't want to return to her previous role and only wants 10 hours a week, she's entitled to return to her previous role. She's not entitled, but she's also entitled to request flexible work as someone returning for parental leave. So again, it's, and you've been consulted with her every 3 months to let her know. Yeah. So just, I think, as I said, I think you've got to treat them as two separate things. There's whether her role exists as it did before she went on parental leave and whether that role is now redundant. If that role no longer exists, then you need to have a consultation discussion with about what role she can return to as redeployment. Now, if you don't have a role that meets what her requirements are coming back to not work those additional hours, then that's no different than if she was coming back from parental leave without the redundancy restructure happening. And she says, well, I only want to come back and work 10 hours a week. The role that we have for you, which was previously the same, or that is an opportunity for redeployment, or the role that you were doing before doesn't exist. So it's, as I said, there's kind of two issues here. There's the return from parental leave. Now, if the role no longer exists that she was in, you can offer her redeployment. Here are the options for redeployment. If there's nothing and there's a business case to not offer her a 10-hour a week role, then that's, you sort of have to handle that separately. But that's, it's always a bit tricky when someone's on parental leave. So if the role has already been made redundant, you could actually almost get it set up at that point. And if she says, well, I don't want that role, but I'd like to explore other roles, you can explore that redeployment when she's ready to come back. And if she's not ready, there's nothing to redeploy her to, then, and how the role has been made redundant, then she's redundant. and it's no different to any other redundancy. But yeah, it does add that extra level of complexity when someone and consulting with her every 3 months to let her know. So if you've let her know that if she's been consulted about the redundancy process and you're just waiting for a return to see what roles are available, it still must, if you're going through, but when you are actually going through a redundancy process, you should always actually involve any employee, and that includes employees that are on parental leave. Do we have any other questions before we finish up? Great questions, guys. I love getting some good questions in here. And look, honestly, sometimes, it might be worthwhile touching base with us offline so that we can talk through the nuances and specifics for that particular person with you, rather than doing it in a public forum. But look, more than happy to, we offer an obligation-free consultation with any new client as well. So at any stage, you're more than welcome to reach out and book in a time with one of our team. Excellent. Well, I haven't had any new ones come through for the last couple of minutes, so I might assume that we don't have. Oh, did we just get another one? Oh, thank you. Thank you. You're welcome. So look, if you do have any other questions after this, please feel free to reach out to our team. I will be sending a copy of this presentation out to everybody that has registered for today, also, and those that attended. Those that were able to attend this evening, lovely to have you. I hope you had a lovely glass of wine or beer or whatever it is that you prefer, or a cup of tea in your hand while you did it. We will also then provide one on our website as well. So we will put a copy, and there are copies of all of our previous webinars that we've done last year and this year are available on our website, and you can go back and watch them at any time. So thank you very much for joining us this evening, and there were some great suggestions in things to cover in future webinars, so we will keep them in mind. I will also let you know that the June webinar will, as always, be, as it was last year, on our upcoming changes to award rates that will be coming in from the start of July. So we usually do that topic every year. But thank you for your time and good evening.